This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to a damning investigation revealing the widespread abusive use of solitary confinement in immigration jails overseen by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture says solitary confinement should only be used in exceptional circumstances and defines extended use of solitary as inhuman and degrading treatment. Despite this, a new devastating report by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists reveals that since 2012, ICE has used solitary confinement as a routine punishment for thousands of immigrants and asylum seekers locked up in immigration jails across the country.
The review of more than 8,400 reports of solitary confinement and ICE detention found immigration officers repeatedly used isolation cells to punish gay, transgender, and disabled immigrants for their identities, and to target other jailed immigrants for actions like kissing consensually or hunger striking. Almost a third of the people held in solitary confinement suffered from mental illness. In at least 373 cases, immigrants were put in isolation for being potentially suicidal. In nearly 200 instances, immigrants were held in solitary confinement for more than half a year. The investigation's called Solitary Voices. This is an excerpt of a video released along with the report.
You're being locked up 23 hours, 22 hours in a day in a small room.
It's like a cage, you know?
It made me feel like going crazy.
You can't even talk to nobody.
I contemplated, trying to hurt myself, kill myself, because I just couldn't bear being alone.
It's hard. It's really hard.
It's presented as though it's a form of protection when, in fact, the experience of the individual is this is extreme punishment. If the only way you can assure the safety of civil detainees who are extremely vulnerable based on their background or their mental or physical health is to put them into a 24-hour, 22-hour lockdown, I think it raises a profound question about the overall system.
That was Ellen Gallagher, Department of Homeland Security Policy Advisor and a whistleblower who repeatedly warned immigration officials that ICE was in violation of its own standards. Solitary Voices is an investigation by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists in collaboration with a number of other news outlets.
Congressmember Ilhan Omar shared the investigation on Twitter Tuesday, writing, "Solitary confinement is torture. It's time we abolish ICE," she wrote. Well, for more, we're joined here in New York by Spencer Woodman, staff reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and lead reporter for the new investigative series Solitary Voices. Welcome to Democracy Now! Great to have you with us. So lay out what you found and how you went about doing this report.
Sure. So we found that ICE has repeatedly overused and misused solitary confinement to manage its sprawling detention network. The report is based on 8,500 incident reports that we obtained through the Freedom of Information Act request, describing individual placements of detainees in solitary confinement. We also interviewed dozens of these detainees who have spent time, sometimes very prolonged periods of time, up to a year in solitary confinement cells at ICE facilities. And along the way, we got wind of a whistleblower who has a supervisory role within the Department of Homeland Security, who has, for years, been trying to affect change internally through formal whistleblowing channels at DHS with little luck. And yesterday she came out publicly for the first time to tell her story.
Now, most Americans are not aware that people being held by ICE in these detention facilities, these are basically, they're under civil penalties. They're not under, they're not being detained for crimes necessarily, right? Can you talk about the distinction and the importance of that in terms of solitary?
That's right. Under U.S. law, and the Supreme Court has repeatedly affirmed this, civil detention cannot be used as a for any form of punishment. It's not punitive in nature. And what we're seeing in immigrant detention in the United States are highly punishing forms of solitary confinement being used on detainees routinely and in many cases as a first resort to manage these facilities. It might be worth it to just kind of step back for a second and talk about what a solitary confinement cell is, because before I started doing this reporting, I didn't totally know what a solitary confinement cell is. I mean, it's not the sort of jail cell you think of with bars on one side and stuff like that. The important thing to remember is that a solitary confinement cell, actually, it's a bathroom-sized room that you're locked in, of course, but it has a solid metal door with, typically with a small window encased with safety glass. And when they close and lock that solid metal door, you are in a armored, sealed box, and you can't get out. And you can't, there is no opportunity to speak with anyone. If you want to have a conversation, get something off your chest, get some fresh air, you can't get out of that little room, and if you yell out, you can be additionally sanctioned to more time in solitary.
We're showing a door that says suicide safe. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, it has been shown over and over again that people held for long periods of time in solitary become more suicidal.
Right. So, I mean, suicidality is one of the among the long list of very serious harms that are well known and well documented that result from being in solitary confinement. One of the things that was quite striking that we came across were hundreds of reports of detainees becoming suicidal in solitary confinement, and then because of their suicidal impulses or even suicide attempts in solitary confinement, being moved to another solitary confinement cell designed to manage suicidal detainees, which are some of these cells are actually more harsh than the cells that drove these detainees to attempt suicide in the first place.
Tell us a little bit about how you got onto this story, because you had initially filed a Freedom of Information request and had gone for a couple of years without any response, and why it was necessary to have an international group of journalists throughout Latin America participate in the uncovering of a story that was basically here in the United States.
Sure. So, yeah, in early 2017, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with ICE asking for agency-wide logs of their placements of detainees in solitary confinement. I had filed a few similar requests of narrower scope around that same time, and I actually, after a few months, I had forgotten I filed this larger request. And about 2 years later, I opened my mailbox to find a letter from ICE with a CD containing a huge trove of thousands and thousands of these incident reports. So that is what basically started the investigation. And ICIJ, where I work, we typically partner with international news organizations to do stories that cross borders.
You did the Panama Papers.
We did the Panama Papers. And so this was a pretty good opportunity to both get the story out to a Spanish language audience and also work with reporters who work in populations who have been affected by solitary confinement at ICE. So,
I want to go to a clip from an NBC interview with two trans women who were held in isolation while in ICE custody. In this clip, you'll hear from Dulce Rivera, a trans woman from Honduras who was kept in solitary confinement for 11 months while in ICE custody and attempted suicide. But first, this is Jocelyn Mendez, a trans woman from Nicaragua who was put in solitary confinement twice for a total of 9 days.
And well, the truth is, what I went through in there is something I don't even wish on my worst enemy. It's horrible. I felt like I really didn't know what was going to happen to me. I felt afraid. I felt that I couldn't even breathe. And at the beginning, I began to scream and scream where they locked me up. I told them, release me. I can't stand it. I am short of breath.
I asked them for help. I told them, I need to see a psychologist. I need to see a psychologist. And what happened is that the guard's response was no. So then I decided to tie a piece of blanket to the window above. And I completely covered the door outside so that no one was seeing what was happening inside the room. I made a lasso. I hung myself. So it's something psychological. mental, that it affected me in being in that place. So disgusting and horrible.
So that was Dulce Rivera in an NBC report. She is from Honduras, originally held in an El Paso processing center. Now I want to turn to a video from the series Solitary Voices. This is Ilyas Moradi, a 30-year-old from Afghanistan who came to the U.S. when he was 12. Moradi has spent most of the last 4 months in solitary at ICE's South Texas detention complex.
My first name is Ilyas, Ilyas Moradi. I'm in a solitary at the moment myself. It's like a cage, you know? The door has a little tiny window in it. There's nothing to see. Seems like I woke up in a nightmare.
Headline: The United States retaliates for the bombing.
I was born in Afghanistan. My father got killed with the bomb in Afghanistan. We got accepted as a refugee to come to the United States. So I was 12 going to 13.
Moradi became a truck driver and had 2 children. He says his permanent resident card was extended in 2017, but months later, U.S. immigration officials stopped him on the way back to Mexico.
They pulled me out of that car. They said that all my papers are wrong. I should have left the country. They arrested me. I've been sitting since 2017 here, and I appealed my case, and the Border of Appeals rejected.
Now Moradi expects to be deported back to Afghanistan.
I have no idea about the country. Every time when I think about it, going there, I get scared, you know? I don't know what's going to happen.
Immigration and Customs Enforcement said Moradi has been put in solitary confinement 7 times for disorderly conduct. When ICIJ reporters talked to him in March and April, he had been in solitary for more than a month.
You think you'll go crazy? I force myself instantly trying to go to sleep or trying to read. You don't have any more hopes.
On April 17th, Moradi was briefly released from isolation. On April 26th, he was locked up again for threatening a staff member and other misconduct, ICE said.
Sometimes you just sit down and be sad and cry. You're 20 to 22 hours a day in the cell by yourself. You get to go outside and then like a little box. All you can see is the sky. Everything else is 4 walls. And all I see is one's going to be the day I can be free, so I don't have to see these walls in front of me, so I can just see freedom.
And that's Ilyas Moradi, 30-year-old from Afghanistan, has been in this country since he was 12 years old, spent most of the last 4 months in solitary in ICE's South Texas detention complex. And Spencer, we're listening to him on the telephone. Explain how you even recorded this.
So Ilyas called me, and, you know, detainees who are put in solitary confinement, their privileges can be severely curtailed. They can, at some point, get access to phone privileges. So that basically means a detention officer hands a phone through the meal slot in that solid metal door and allows them to talk on the phone, usually kind of huddled up to the door because the phone cord isn't very long. So that was him, that was Ilyas Moradi in his solitary confinement cell talking to me. You know, it's worth noting that people who are already in psychological distress are much more prone to the worst harms of solitary confinement. And a lot of people in immigration detention are under a lot of stresses. I mean, they've been, in many cases, separated from their families. In a lot of cases, they're pending removal back to countries where they might not be safe. So this is the case of Ilyas Moradi, and, you know, the psychological decompensation that happens in solitary confinement was pretty obvious talking to him. There were certain points where he broke down and he wasn't really able to have a conversation. And that kind of that difficulty socializing and just that basic emotional distress we found over and over again when we talked to particularly people in solitary confinement, the difficulty to even have a conversation.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there, but we will link to your piece. Spencer Woodman, a staff reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, lead reporter on this new investigative series, Solitary Voices, on the widespread misuse of solitary confinement in ICE detention centers. When we come back, we'll look at how a predatory lending scheme has put many New York taxi drivers into debilitating debt, creating a system that's been likened to modern-day indentured servitude. Back in 30 seconds.